Hey, welcome back to Chapter 2 of Killing Shrubs and Hunting Bugs. My name is Dale Luckwitz, and today we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the cultural aspects of the Barberry Eradication Campaign and touch back on my father's role. Having taken a few classes in the spring of 1961 at Kent State University, my father didn't find collegiate life a good fit. Having difficulty landing a steady job, he then received his pre-induction notice for the U.S. draft in November of 1961. This was following the Berlin crisis, and he took his military physical in December of that year. So the idea of working for the government, well, outside of the military, wasn't even on the table. But in spring 1961, my father's wife, my mother, who at the time was working at the Ohio Bureau of Unemployment in Cleveland, Ohio, notified him of an upcoming USDA job. Not thinking he had a chance at the job, and with the looming possibility of being drafted in the war, he thought, why not? And he went for the interview. Now, I don't have any pictures of this, unfortunately, but I was told about it. Showing up with a tan corduroy sports jacket and a tie, he was the only person wearing a tie, let alone a sports jacket. He filled out a few forms, had a short interview. He was hired on the spot. This was a solid, interesting entry-level job for a 22-year-old newly married man, one that would provide travel and physical activity, so my father was happy with this. His primary role with the USDA, although not the only role, was to find, record, and eradicate the common barberry bush that we've talked about earlier, and other barberry plants that could play as an alternate host to black stem rust. In essence, my father became part of a small crew of men who roamed the countryside of Ohio looking to kill shrubbery. By the time my father began with the USDA, cultural awareness of the threat of the common barberry had subsided from the fever pitch at the beginning of the program. But in the 1920s and 1930s, this awareness had been much different. As much a public relations campaign as an eradication campaign, early print advertisements and posters from the government worked with intentional planning to repaint the once beloved plant as a dreaded enemy of the state. P.D. Peterson, that's P.D., not Petey, but P.D. Peterson, a scholar and teacher of plant pathology as well as a plant historian at the American Phytopathological Society, he documented the amazing and actually quite clever public relations campaign undertaken by the federal government in this regard. In a feature article Peterson wrote called The Barberry or Bread, Peterson artfully showed how the U.S. government had pulled out all the stops to discredit the common barberry in preparing for its eradication because, after all, nobody wants to destroy what they cherish. Peterson showed example of ads connecting the common barberry to the German Kaiser during World War I, to communism. One poster referred to the common barberry as the, quote, red-handed anarchist of the grain fields, unquote. It compared it to thieves out to steal crops, even tax collectors, anything that would put a bad imagery of the common barberry in people's minds. While each state participating in the Barberry Eradication Campaign handled outreach differently, they all drew from the same federal resources to reach the public in various ways as an all-concerted, all-in effort. As reported in the 1929 Barberry Eradication Campaign scorecard booklet, Progress of the Barberry Eradication Campaign in North Dakota in 1929, quote, as the barberry bushes remaining become fewer in number, the need for widespread cooperation on the part of the public becomes more apparent. Reports of suspected bushes in local rust spread areas are of great value. Because of the situation, a greater effort is being made each year to bring facts regarding the project before the general public. The purposes of these educational activities is to explain the principles of the campaign, teach the identification of the common barberry bush and its relationship to the common barberry, stimulate the public to cooperate, and summarize and record the progress being made. This work is carried on through newspapers, by educating children in the schools, fair demonstrations, window displays, motion picture and slides, and by radio talks, unquote. You can see this was a PR campaign. Maligned in ads and posters in carefully manipulative ways, the common barberry was presented as complicit in the spread of black stem rust, sometimes drawn as a cartoon demon invading the American way of life. Citizens young and old were enlisted to stop its spread, and even youth groups were formed, such as the National Rust Busters Club, which enlisted young boys and girls and gave them a medal on a ribbon if they found a culprit barberry bush. To give you a sense of the civic pride, I found this in a 1952 USDA Employee News Bulletin. It was a small article entitled Medals Mean Much, and it highlighted a decorated Navy man who lost his medals during an overseas transfer. While the Navy replaced his Navy medals, the man wrote the USDA saying he mourned the loss of his 2 Rust Buster gold medals that he earned as a boy fighting barberry bushes in rural Indiana. He carried those medals around with him the world over and said they represented quite an achievement for him as a child. The USDA replaced the medals, even though by 1952 the Rust Busters had faded out of existence. But it shows how significant barberry eradication was to cultural mindset in the 1930s. Interestingly, even with the pioneering research in stem rust, plant pathologist Stackman was instrumental in getting the Barberry Eradication Campaign going in a different way that could be argued was ultimately more significant to its existence. He was largely responsible for bringing in private money. In a biography of Stackman called E.C. Stackman, Statesman of Science, author Christensen offers the Stackman quote that shows Stackman's ability to bridge the gap between scientific findings and pragmatic real-world concerns. Quote, obviously, it seemed that if this campaign was to succeed, you had to have influential people to push it, and insofar as scientists, shall we say, are usually poor lobbyists and are suspected by money-granting institutions of just wanting to build their institutions for their own satisfaction, it seemed best to have the people who were really affected by rust, to have them help assure their responsibility for carrying things out, unquote. Now, I located the above quote not at first through the original biography, but through the doctoral dissertations of P.D. Peterson mentioned earlier. His paper from 2003 called The Common Barberry, The Past and Present Situation in Minnesota and the Risk of Wheat Stem Rust Epidemics, is a wealth of historical information on the campaign. Peterson's dissertation was the key source to beginning to help me understand how all the little pieces fit together. Pulling from the same source, Peterson noted that Stackman helped assemble together top executives from industry, railroads, farming. For example, the president of Deere Weber Farm Machinery Company to help lobby the idea of a concerted, federally led barberry campaign, which of course, would require federal money. This private industry outreach led the industry to fund the Rust Prevention Association, which in 1922 morphed into the Conference for the Prevention of Grain Rust, a powerhouse for lobbying efforts. As part of testimony before a congressional budget hearing in March of 1922, seeking federal appropriations for barberry eradication efforts for fiscal year 1923, Harrison Fuller, secretary of the Conference for the Prevention of Grain Rust, had strong words about the importance of the newly formed organization, which had only come into place in December of 1922. Fuller, giving testimony along E.C. Stackman to subcommittee chairman Senator McDairy, stated, "This is not a conference formed for the purpose of coming before you and passing the buck to Congress, as I think we have shown. It is an actual, bona fide organization which has a budget of $100,000 from private sources for publicity work. It is made up of the millers and grain men who realize that they will be out of business before very long unless the barberry bush is exterminated. We, on our part, will carry on a publicity campaign from one end of this area to the other through the Farm Bureau Federation and schools and women's clubs and all the organizations whose cooperation we can obtain. I mentioned that to show you how very real is the feeling of the people of our district in regard to barberry eradication. You can see that this was a concerted effort that was being led not just by the federal government, but by private business and farming organizations. The Conference for the Prevention of Grain Rust brought together key state government officials from the first 13 states in the Barberry Eradication Campaign, governor, commissioner of agriculture, experimental station rep, representative for the State Farm Bureau, to bring information to the public and lobbying to Washington. The key point here is that the conference was made possible by private industry money. Now, it was after the formation of the Conference for the Prevention of Grain Rust that outreach efforts really began. Newspapers in the 13 participating states saw press releases detailing the program arrive with plenty of bulletins, posters, and leaflets distributed showing the threat from the common barberry. During this time, it would not have been uncommon to see a poster decrying the evils of the common barberry clearly posted at your local grange, feed store, railroad office, or general store. The government let people know that destroying the common barberry was the civic duty of every patriotic man, woman, and child. Back testifying before a congressional appropriations hearing for the USDA's fiscal year 1924 budget, Mr. Fuller estimated that money allocated from the federal government led to some 500,000 pieces of publicity, including posters and brochures, having been sent, and some 2,500 columns of newspaper space secured. He also stated that barberry eradication exhibits were sponsored at some 30 to 35 state fairs, 108 county fairs, and a few larger expositions, such as the National Dairy Show in St. Paul, Minnesota. This civic pride continued into the 1930s. In a 1931 radio interview on NBC's National Farm and Home Hour going out to 43 NBC associate stations, F.C. Meyer, then in charge of barberry eradication efforts at the USDA's Bureau of Plant Industry, appealed to all listeners to, quote, take a hand, hunting down, reporting to your state agricultural college, and thus helping to destroy the outlaw plants of the common barberry. You'll be performing an act of good citizenry if you do, unquote. In Ohio, by 1962, the people my father encountered, at least outside of the farming community, they seldom had an idea what, and most importantly, why my father was doing what he was doing. The rustbuster youth pride of the Depression era and before had drifted into obscurity, so that my father's job of traipsing through yards, fields, and woods was seen as some type of obscure government venture. Many people my father encountered did not even know what a barberry was, let alone how a harmless-looking bush could be so dangerous. The times had changed from 1931, when Park Commissioner at Brown City Park in Bellefontaine, Ohio, surrounded a common barberry bush with clear signage for all picnickers and casual visitors to see, as they were, quote, anxious for as many people as possible to see the bush and learn how to identify the common barberry, unquote. And that I pulled from Stem Rust and Barberry News from August 15th of 1931. Certainly my father's job was not suited for someone afraid of getting his hands dirty. Now, the field work my father did was physical and obviously conducted primarily outdoors year-round. While not as frigid as Minnesota or North Dakota, the Buckeye State of Ohio still had its share of cold winters, but barberry work carried on regardless. My father began his tenure with the USDA facing two particularly cold and snowy winters, in 1962 and 1963. Like any government job, there was a hierarchy with varying pay levels. While supervisors and district supervisors generally had college degrees, and government agricultural inspectors held advanced education in horticulture or a related field, the boots-on-the-ground workers like my father almost never did. My father was part of the labor force doing the heavy lifting and legwork they did, traveling all over the state into some of the most remote areas of Ohio. The people doing this work, like my father, were nicknamed Barberry Grunts. On my father's first day on the job, he was taken to Burton, Ohio, on the edge of a swamp, where a large common barberry was growing. A large specimen full of bright red fruit. A large fruiting barberry was nicknamed a fruiter by barberry workers. This bush had been left as a training tool for new members. The common barberry bush wasn't on government property, but grew in a nondescript remote area where nobody would likely bother it. Likewise, a few other training barberry bushes had been left in Punderson, Ohio, again on private scrubland. The workers knew they were there, even if the bushes were simply ordinary shrubberies to others. In terms of training, there were no classroom sessions with slideshows, no onboarding meetings, no practice sessions with a partner, and no workbooks or interactive learning experiences. Training began for my father on the job in the field. His first day of barberry surveying began in Russell Township in Geauga County, Ohio, behind the Novelty Post Office. The historic building on Route 306 with its giant postage stamp on the side, it still stands, although it's no longer a federal post office, but now a private building. The area behind the post office at the time was thick, nasty brush, a tricky place to begin learning to spot the common barberry, but terrain didn't matter in a barberry survey. When looking for barberry bushes, most areas of Ohio were fair game except for cultivated fields, ponds, and swamplands, but even swamps weren't completely off the table. If areas in a swamp bore trees or upland shrubs, the area would still need to be checked. In Geauga County, Ohio, which was considered the barberry capital of Ohio, this meant almost all of the county, through Newberry, Auburn, Troy, Burton, and Middlefield. My father primarily worked in the eastern region of Ohio, from Lake Erie to the north to the Ohio River in the south, although he was sometimes loaned out for cross-border jobs in Kentucky or West Virginia. While the main focus was locating and destroying the common barberry, not all barberry species were susceptible to rust, and one related plant, Mejoberberus nuberti, a sterile greenhouse hybrid between a barberry and a mahonia bush, also made the hit list. The Japanese barberry was expressly called out as a safe alternative to the common barberry in various farmer bulletins, government newsletters, and promotional materials. Barberry plants that were easily identifiable, such as the Japanese barberry, the Korean barberry, or the pale leaf barberry, the ones that were known to be resistant to stem rust, they were allowed to live. Exotic barberry species, or ones that simply could not be definitively identified, still had a chance. A sample would be collected by a barberry grunt and sent to a government laboratory, where a botanist would make a positive ID and determine if the barberry could stay or go. A barberry bush's ability to serve as an alternate host for black stem rust, not its ornamental value, determined its fate. Even 50 years later, my father still remembers a noble upright barberry found at a residential estate in the wealthy Cleveland suburb of Moreland Hills. The bush was tall, beautifully formed. It was a cultivar variety of which my father had never seen before, showcasing a gorgeous blue tint, and had been found by one of the youngest members of the team, a part-timer who didn't stay with the program long. Now, the bush was growing alongside a manor house, my father tells me, obviously planted and probably quite rare. The barberry's heritage and beauty in the end couldn't save its life, however, as it was found to be of a variety capable of hosting the fungus. The plant, to my father's dismay, was cut down and the earth treated with poison. He had the sad duty of being its executioner. Barberry grunts then needed to develop keen eyes for not only spotting, but also for identifying plants, whether full-grown species or little snippets of seedlings poking through the grass. Far removed from today when someone can snap a picture with a cell phone and check details online, my father was armed with a 58-page 9x6 manual bound with a flexible plastic binding, the revised February 1958 Nursery Inspection Manual, Barberry Eradication, to be exact. The manual itself wasn't even created for the job of barberry eradication teams, but was instead geared to commercial nursery inspections. The manual was, however, what was available to workers at the time in Ohio and had some information that might be useful in the barberry bush hunt. In that manual, along with some basic background information and suggestions for gathering samples, was a one-page plant black and white description of a number of barberry bushes, providing their official Latin name, key identifying factors of the bush, and some grainy images of the leaves, spines, berries, and branches. All the quality of a low resolution scan today. My father's work with barberry was primarily dealing with plants growing in the wild, on residence or even on public lands, and not so much in commercial nurseries, which fell under the role of federal USDA inspectors. The federal black stem rust quarantine number 38, however, did not expressly deal with the surveying and eradication of plants in the wild. It was instead a source of guidance for nurseries. To meet stipulations of the federal rule, which extended beyond states involved in the eradication effort, nurseries needed to be free of all rust-susceptible barberry, mahonia, and Mejobarbaris plants. While the Barberry Eradication Campaign has since gone away, nurseries in the U.S. must still adhere to strict restrictions set forth by the federal black stem rust quarantine number 38. Now, according to my father, working in early winter with the light snow on the ground was actually some of the best times to find barberry bushes. Because of the bush's distinctive shape and branching pattern, distinctive at least to a trained eye, the bush was easier to spot than within the greenery of surrounding trees and bushes when the weather was warmer, especially if the barberries were sporting their red berries. Springtime, however, was the most difficult time to find the plants, as the flourish of green leaves and flowers obscured the barberry amidst the rest of the foliage. Father learned his training for barberry eradication in the field. It wasn't tested outside of the school of actually doing. Earlier iterations of barberry men had more formalized training, at least it appears. In my research, I came across a fairly robust written test that barberry men in the early phases of the Barberry Eradication Campaign needed to pass. The test, archived by the USDA in the National Agricultural Library, dated from 1926 and features 10 pages of robust and challenging written questions. The questions were broken into sections such as identification, distribution, stem rust, surveys of the eradication of common barberries, eradication, manual and chemical, publicity, and general. And this was an example question. What is the total acreage and production of all wheat raised in your state during the past season? Additionally, in the July 1st, 1931 edition of the Division of Barberry Eradication's Stem Rust and Barberry News, a detailed description of the classroom and field training listed gives a sense of the preparation work that went into bringing aboard new barberry field crews. Here's just a sample from that publication. Our training school for Barberry Scouts was held June 16th and 17th in Bellefontaine, near the territory where barberry activities are in progress. On the morning of June 16th, different members of the group discussed problems relative to our job. In the afternoon, Dr. Stover of the Plant Pathology Department of Ohio State University explained the different stages of black stem rust, using microscopic slides and the blackboard for diagram. Mr. Fred Connolly, a farmer near Zanesville, Logan County, appeared on the program and related in a very interesting way his experience with common barberries and black stem rust. And it goes on into detail about guest speakers and classroom activities. Now, that section was detailing preparation for field workers in Ohio, but similar training and preparation work in the 1930s for barberry field workers was being conducted in other states as well. At least in Ohio, by the 1960s, this type of training, particularly the historical and academic portions of the program, was gone and lost on the average field worker, and my father suspects it was likely the case in most other states. Certainly, the idea of a 2-day classroom session was far removed from my father's experiences. For most of the fellow workers my father encountered, they had a job to do. They did it well, but they didn't know much about the history of the campaign, and this information definitely wasn't taught or expressly mentioned to them. Many times during the research for this book, I shared some element of the history of the Barberry Eradication Campaign, and this came as a complete surprise to my father. So by the 1960s, the background of the program provided to early barberry eradication workers, the beginning of the campaign in 1918, had moved into academia. Regardless of the importance of the work, the days of the dramatic posters and radio broadcasts on the evils of the common barberry, they were long gone. Partly as a result of this cultural promotion of the Barberry Eradication Campaign, then, Barberry workers, at least in Ohio, although perhaps elsewhere, would be used to service other area needs of the USDA. Now, in Chapter 3, I'll talk a little bit more of some of these other USDA experiences my father had, particularly road patrol. If you would like information on the bibliographic information on this, there is an extensive multi-page bibliography on all the sources that I pulled, where to find them, and so forth. You can find that on the related web page. The link is in the description below. Of course, if you like what you're hearing, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. There will be further chapters of the book coming up. Thanks a lot. This is Dale Luckwitz. Talk to you in next chapter.